Fantastic. Very simply, I'm going to just essentially explain why you need creativity and why you need behavioral science, I think, and why behavioral science is a great aid to discovery in one sentence, which is this: that there are far more good ideas that we can post-rationalize than there are good ideas we can pre-rationalize. By which I mean, if we insist on using rational, sequential, inductive logic to generate every new idea, we will only generate, using those tools, a small proportion of the overall set of ideas that might work. And I think there are a variety of reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that we get our idea of science wrong. So what we tend to think of science is a case where we use pre-existing known data to solve a problem and arrive at a single optimal or right answer. So the typical high school maths question is something like this. It's two buses leave a bus station at noon, and one of them travels due north at a constant speed of 30 kilometers an hour, and the other one travels due west at a constant speed of 40 kilometers an hour. What time is it when the two buses are 100 kilometers apart? Which is actually 2 p.m. because the two buses are effectively sides of a 3, 4, 5 triangle. Now, that we come to think of as science. So we say we have this data, we must use the data we have to arrive at an answer. But it's worth noting that that question is highly unrepresentative of most real world questions, because one, you have all the information you know to arrive at a single optimally correct solution. The information you know is expressible in mathematical form, i.e. speed and time. And there's a single obviously correct answer to the question, which only requires the information you have to solve the problem. Now, of course, in reality, even that maths question is making some stupid assumptions. Buses never travel in straight lines, they never leave on time, and they usually get stuck in traffic, so they don't travel at a constant speed. You might instantly add that the assumption is slightly silly because buses presumably have to accelerate from stationary to reach that speed. But for the purposes of the maths question, we assume that the bus goes in a millisecond from 0 kilometers an hour to 30. Something which would obviously kill the passengers if you were to do it in reality. And so what we're obsessed with doing is we're obsessed with taking what we know and turning it into the kind of question where there's a single right answer. Now, fundamentally, most real world questions aren't like that. We don't know everything we need to know, and quite a lot of the things that are important are not necessarily mathematically expressible. So, for example, if you're dealing with human behavior, we don't have SI units for things like regret or empathy, or we don't have an SI unit, for example, for compassion. Okay, so once you're dealing with human behavior, you're outside this narrow artificial realm where you have a physics problem with a single right answer, which you can solve, and where there's one right answer, and anything that isn't that right answer is wrong. Okay, we love things like that because, of course, teachers like them because they're really easy to mark. And we like them because they make decisions really unambiguous. There's no scope for opinion, subjectivity, and they don't require experiment because all the information is already there in front of you. There's no need to experiment in that question. So that's one problem. And what this leads to, I think, is a fundamental problem when we try and be scientific in business, which is we try and solve the problem through induction or deduction. In other words, look at the facts on the table and see what the facts can possibly tell us about an answer. Now, one of the greatest American minds of the 19th century was a man called Charles Sanders Peirce. It's actually spelt P-E-I-R-C-E. Nobody's heard of him. Don't worry that you've never heard of him. But Bertrand Russell thought he was the greatest American thinker of the 19th century. And he made the point very vociferously that in most real world situations, including science, what we're using to make progress isn't really induction or deduction. It's not a logical sequential process in the way we think. What it is what he called abductive inference. An abductive inference works like this. You notice something strange and you ask yourself the question, what would have to be true in order for this strange circumstance to occur? And that requires imagination and it requires hypothesis. Now, if you think about it, detective work is mostly that. You find a dead body and you have to do what Arthur Conan Doyle called reasoning backwards. You have the corpse, that's the fact, and now you have to guess which of many possible previous situations or circumstances most plausibly led to the fact that there's a dead body on the floor. Darwin's theory, the whole of Darwin arose from abductive inference. That's strange, all these finches have different shaped beaks. What would have to be, even though they live on islands that are only a small distance apart, one explanation for that is God designs the finches in order to have beaks that suit the flora of the particular island in the archipelago in which they're found. That's one explanation. God designed them that way. Darwin asked the question, what else might lead to this consequence? What mechanism could exist in nature which would cause the shapes of these finches' beaks to diverge according to the environment in which they find themselves? If you look at another case, if you look at the case of Fleming with penicillin, he goes, that's strange. There's a bit of fungus in this petri dish and all the bacteria around it seem to have died. What might be true of this bacterium in order to obtain, of this fungus, to achieve this effect? So most progress, most breakthroughs in science involve a degree of hypothesis, which means a degree of imagination and a degree of subjective judgment as to which explanation is best investigated. Now, you then go on, when you've had your creative hypothesis, you go on to test it. Now, what I think happens, and I think this happens with big data, is that we think we know much more than we know because we have a lot of data. In truth, with big data, there are quite a lot of problems with big data. All of it comes from the same place, which is the past. Therefore, you can't always rely on the past to tell you about the future. I'll give you one example of this. During the pandemic, every single airline in the world had to turn off their pricing algorithms and start pricing flights manually using humans. Why was that? It was because all of the algorithms had learnt their skills in a time when if you dropped the price of a flight, more people wanted to fly. And suddenly in the pandemic, they found themselves in a situation where that rule no longer applied because 2% of people who wanted to get home would pay almost anything to get on an aeroplane. And 98% of people wouldn't board a plane if you put a gun to their head. And so pricing flights in 2020 as though it were 2018 led to complete disaster because the algorithms just kept dropping the price of flights and nobody wanted to get on board. So the algorithm, which was very intelligent in 2018, was totally stupid in 2020. And they had to turn the damn thing off and start doing the thing manually. And so it's really important to remember that most questions, we don't have the answer to the question. We have clues, as a detective does. We have some clues. We have various bits of unconnected information. And it's actually the job of the human imagination with abductive inference to try and work out what pattern of events best fit available knowledge. What we do instead is we think what we know is all there is to know, and we try and derive a decision simply from the information that happens to be pre-existing. Now, as a result, as I said, when we try and use logical inference and deduction, we only uncover at best a small fraction of the solutions that actually might be out there. There are far more good ideas you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. Okay. Secondly, some of the things we think are logical and true actually turn out to be wrong. And I'm going to quickly share my screen here and just show you one example of a test for Christian Aid. And I'll explain what it is. Here we go. I'll share this. Every year, Christian Aid in the UK has something called Christian Aid Week. And volunteers deliver envelopes to most of the houses in their local area. I think they aim to cover more or less the whole country. It always used to be about 25 million households, apart from maybe the most remote rural areas. And they drop this envelope, and then they come back and collect it a week later. You can post it, obviously. You can put credit card donations in, but you can also put cash or money or a check into the envelope and hand it back. Now, what was interesting about this was that we looked at 6 things you might test that might make a difference, that might actually improve the success of this fundraising campaign. And we used behavioral science to do it. And we suggested 5 things that were effectively psychological and 1 thing that was logical. Okay, so the one I suggested, I suggested just making the envelope paper slightly thicker and more expensive. And we call this, we call this costly signaling. The thicker paper stock, it just makes the piece of paper more serious and more important in the consumer's mind because you've spent slightly more money producing it, okay? One of them was changing the orientation of the envelope so that the flap was along the narrow edge of the envelope, not the wide edge. And we said that feels more like an envelope you put money into. If you've got an envelope like a pay packet where you put money in it, okay, naturally, you tend to have the flap down the narrow end because you don't want the flap to burst open and the money to spill out. And it would just feel safer putting larger amounts of money in an envelope where the flap was on the narrow edge, not the wide edge. Okay, that's psychological again. There's no logical reason why that should affect your behavior. Okay, in one case, we put the labor illusion. We mentioned the fact that the envelope was hand delivered. And that was partly to create what we call reciprocation bias, okay, which is if this person's gone to a little bit of effort to deliver the envelope, I feel slightly, it's incumbent upon me to give something back, you know, in return for their effort. We mentioned scarcity, this week only. You only have 1 week to give. That was to create kind of impatience and scarcity, rather like the airlines do when they say only 4 seats left at this price. And we also did cognitive ease, where we just put appeal donation envelope on the envelope, I think. Okay. And the logical suggestion, the suggestion that was completely logical, was we mentioned something called gift aid, which exists in the UK, where it said boost your donation by 25% for free. So if you're a UK taxpayer, every £1 you give into this envelope, if you sign the little gift aid form, the government gives an extra 25 pence, which is effectively, you know, the share of that £1 that you've already been taxed on, the government gives back. Now that is a completely logical suggestion, you might argue, saying that every £1 you give, we get 1.25. You'd say we don't need to test that. It's completely logical, isn't it? Because why would that not motivate you to give? It means that every £1 you give makes more than the pound's difference. It makes £1.25 difference. Now, we said of all the 6, that was the one that a board would approve without demanding a test. They go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. We should mention gift aid. We'll put gift aid on the envelope. Let's do that. No need to test. Nothing to see here. You know, let's just go and do it. Now, what in fact happened with the results was that 4 of the 5, scarcity this week only, trying to create urgency, in this case didn't work. Worth knowing, it didn't work. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't terrible. It just didn't make any difference. Okay. 4 of the 5 irrational suggestions increased total donations by 10 to 17% relative to the control. And these are huge numbers. They're 50,000, 60,000 envelopes in receipt of each test. Okay. The thicker paper not only increased the number of people giving because you felt more guilty throwing away a better quality envelope, but the number of people who put £100 or more in as a donation went up really significantly. Because cognitively, the way the brain works is putting £100 in a slightly posh, slightly high quality envelope seems like a normal thing to do. Putting £100 into a really flimsy, cheap envelope that's obviously been produced at the minimal possible cost, that feels like there's a slight cognitive dissonance to putting large amounts of money in crappy stationery. What's also important, we don't know this until next year, is that many of those 3 suggestions, or those 4 suggestions, next year, we could try combining them. And maybe we'll get a multiplier effect, and this time we'll raise the money by 25%, okay? Now, all of those things, nobody could have argued without testing. And in fact, we couldn't really have argued for the tests without behavioral science. Quite commonly, charities test using cheaper paper because they just want to check that, you know, the really cheap paper doesn't depress response, but they very rarely test using more expensive paper. The business of putting the flap on the narrow edge rather than putting the flap down the long edge seems almost silly, right? It seems almost trivial. And yet that made, I think, a 14% difference to donations when you combined both value and volume. Here's the real surprise, okay? If you mentioned gift aid, the logical thing to do, the amount of money you raised went down over 30%. Over 30% reduction in the amount of money raised. Sorry. And so here you have a case where the one rational suggestion, the one that people would have implemented without requiring a test, is actually killing children. You know, I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing to do. It's a terrible just repressor of response. 4 of the 5 irrational or psychological interventions increase response by more than 10% every time. And if you combine them, there's the possibility. I don't think they'll add up. I don't think they'll multiply completely. I genuinely don't think it works that way. But I think you could combine all 4 of them and possibly obtain a 20% increase in response. But here's the really important thing. It's not only the fact that the psychological, slightly irrational, counterintuitive ideas worked, it's the fact that the rational idea that made complete sense to everybody didn't work. In fact, it not only didn't work, it was actually really, really bad. And this comes to my point, which is we know much less than we think we know. And that if we only do the things that make sense, sometimes we'll make terrible hidden mistakes because we don't bother to test or question things that make sense. And sometimes we'll miss a huge number of better solutions because of our requirement that everything we test makes sense in advance. And I made this point very simply about businesses. I said, if I look at Starbucks, if I look at Dyson, if I look at Five Guys, if I look at Nespresso, okay, none of those businesses made sense to begin with. Red Bull, okay, it's a really expensive drink. It comes in a tiny can and it tastes disgusting. No one was asking for that, were they? No one was going around in 1980, in my childhood in the 1980s. I don't remember anybody at university going, you know what annoys me? Quite often, I feel the urge to buy a really small drink for a large amount of money that tastes horrible, but there isn't one, right? Now, what's going on with Red Bull? I think what's going on is very simple and very interesting. I think what's happening here is that if you sold Red Bull as a drink, it would be a disaster. But if you sell it as a drug or as a placebo or as a psychoactive substance, those very things that make it a bad drink, and it researched terribly. In market research, people said, this is the most disgusting drink I've ever tasted. I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. Okay. And the company reported back and said, this is the most unpopular drink we've ever researched in the entire history of our company. It's a company that only researches the taste of carbonated drinks. And they said, of all the drinks we've ever researched, this one's the worst. But I'm going to introduce you now to the fact that a lot of things only make sense in retrospect. Okay. There are far more good ideas we can post-rationalize and make sense of in retrospect than there are good ideas we can pre-rationalize. Secondly, we know a lot less than we think we know. And the point with Red Bull is if something's a drug, the small can says it's really potent. They can't give me a full can because I go doolally. The high price, we know that placebos work much better if people know they're expensive. And the weird taste is what you'd expect from a psychoactive substance. If you think about it, coffee tastes pretty weird. Beer tastes weird, tea tastes weird, okay? If you want people to believe the substance is psychoactive, make it taste weird. So, and the final point I'll make, okay, and the final point I'll make is two things, therefore. Both of them come from Niels Bohr, the physicist. So I'm not being unscientific here. I'm quoting one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. And here are two quotes from Niels Bohr, okay? One of them, when he criticized a colleague, he said, you are not thinking, you are merely being logical, okay? And the second one is also a Niels Bohr quote. A very trivial but interesting fact, by the way, Niels Bohr's brother was also a physicist, Danish, but he also won an Olympic silver medal for Denmark in football, which is kind of interesting, okay? You wouldn't expect a physicist to be a footballer. That's Niels Bohr's brother for you. But here's the second thing, Niels Bohr, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. Now we forget that. I can stop sharing the screen at this point. We forget that because we've grown up with those high school maths questions where the right answer is the right answer and anything else is wrong. You know, in high school science, the opposite of the right answer is wrong. In a complex system, in a system that changes over time, the opposite of a good idea, as Niels Bohr spotted, can be another good idea. Now, let me give an example of that, okay? The biggest idea in my life in charity fundraising was getting people on low direct debits for very small monthly amounts and gradually upgrading them over time, okay? Now, to give some credit to myself, I was proposing that back in the early 1990s, before it got done. Now, I think 20 years before, there were reasons it wouldn't work, not least because most people hated direct debits and standing orders. They hated regular payments coming automatically out of their bank. But by the time of the 1980s or 90s, that had become normalized. People were more comfortable with it. But here's the thing. It's the opposite of a good idea. What I used to do when I worked in charity fundraising in the 1990s, in the late 80s, the whole purpose was to get large donations from a few people. And my instinctive thing said, well, often we're trying to do that, getting a small number of very large donations from a few people. What if we tried the complete opposite, where we asked everybody to give us £1? And I kept asking that question. And that fundamental thing, nobody tested it because they said, no, we know from charity donation, we know that the best thing to do is to get a small number of people to give you a huge amount of money. And so all their creative work was effectively directed to that end. And by the way, that's still true. It's still a great way to raise money. There are loads and loads of fundraising activities which operate that way. Look, what we really need is to get 20 people to give us £10,000. Okay? But if you read Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, what you see is the ways to influence people are strangely contradictory. We always say in advertising, there are two ways to sell a product. Everybody has this product, so it must be good, or very few people have this product, so it must be good. Okay, you can sell a product on the basis of scarcity and rarity, and you can sell it on the basis of social proof. You know, how bad can this product be? Millions of people have one, but you can also say there are only 10 of these in the world and everybody wants one. So quite often in psychology, particularly, and as a complex system, the opposite of a good idea is another good idea. But we get fixated on what we know, and we spend too little time asking the questions, what don't we know? Because what don't we know is always much, much bigger a set than what we know. And there's a final story about this, which I'll end on before we go into questions, which is bees have learnt this in evolution. So bees have perfected a thing called the waggle dance, where they can do a little dance on the wall of the hive, and it tells other bees the direction and distance in which there's a source of nectar and pollen. And the length of the dance is proportionate to the quality of the source of food. And bee scientists studying bee journeys were very surprised to notice that a significant number of bees seem to ignore the waggle dance. So let's say it's about 20%. It varies according to a whole variety of environmental factors and how close you are to the equator, because foliage tends to be different the closer you are to the tropics. So it varies according to what is optimal for the surrounding foliage. But roughly speaking, they looked at this and they said, bees have been around for 20 million years. It's extraordinary that bee evolution hasn't devised kind of bee accountants and bee compliance officers who make all the bees obey the waggle dance to maximize the efficient collection of pollen and nectar. But they couldn't understand why evolution hadn't done this, because why would evolution tolerate what they thought was an inefficiency for about 20 years, for 20 million years? And then they modeled this as a complex system, and they realized that, first of all, the environment changes. If you don't send out exploratory experimental bees, you get optimized, what Gerd Gigerenzer in Germany, a wonderful man, calls you're optimized on the past. All big data comes from the same place. It comes from the past. If you only use pre-existing data to make decisions, you're making decisions for yesterday, not decisions for tomorrow. Okay? Or you're making decisions for tomorrow, but you're not really making good decisions for 3 weeks' time. It's like weather forecasting. You can sort of forecast the weather tomorrow, but you can't forecast the weather in 5 days' time, or you can actually. 20 days' time is impossible, basically. You just don't know. Okay, now, the interesting thing there is that there are several reasons you send out the rogue bees. One, the waggle dance bees tell you what you know, but the rogue bees find out what you don't yet know. It enables you to adapt to changing circumstances. It allows you to get lucky, and it prevents you from fragilizing yourself by becoming over-optimized on 2 or 3 sources of food, which means that if some cows break into your favorite field and eat all the flowers, the hive starves to death because it gets trapped in what complexity theorists call a local maximum. And that's the need for, so what I've basically told you is we need to experiment more. We need to experiment more with things that don't make sense. And we need to experiment with the opposite of what makes sense, because the opposite of what makes sense, or the opposite of what works, may be another source of nectar, another source of wealth. And at the moment, we're not doing this. We're only, because testing is portrayed as a cost, not as a necessary part of the process, we're only testing the things that make sense to test. I'll end with a story about this, which is I was in a meeting with KFC, and they said, we've got this product in South Africa. It's quite a good product, but it's not selling very well. So we're going to try dropping the price. And I butted into the conversation and rather bravely said, you should also try putting the price up. And they looked at me as if I was slightly nuts, okay? Because they said, well, look, if the product's not selling at this price, it's not going to sell at a higher price. And I said, trust me, it might. Now, I said, just to be clear about this, I don't think it's likely. There is a lower than 50% probability that putting the price up will increase demand. But it's a much more valuable discovery than knowing you can drop the price and increase demand. Secondly, a lot of people just drop the price without testing it. Now, that assumes that dropping the price always increases demand. Sometimes it doesn't. So people don't test things which seem logical and won't test things which seem illogical. And both those things are mistakes. And so the great example I always give here is, funnily enough, that example with KFC. I said, test putting the price up. It's not an expensive thing to test. In the digital world, of course, you can test these things very, very quickly. And sure enough, demand went up. Now, as I said at the very beginning, this is why we need creativity, because there are more good ideas you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. It's impossible to pre-rationalize why putting the price up might work. But at the same time, I think knowing that it works, we might be able to explain it. I would argue that we go into KFC for two different reasons. Different people, different times, different occasions. We go in for a bargain and we go in for a treat. And if you have a product at KFC which is priced in between the two, it's not a bargain and it's not a treat, so nobody buys it. Five Guys is clever because they made the burger so expensive it feels like a treat in a way that McDonald's doesn't. But Five Guys has also been clever because they don't charge for toppings. They give you free drinks refills. They give you free peanuts. They give you an extra helping of fries for free. So Five Guys makes the two really indulgent things on their menu, the burger and the shake. Those are really expensive, but everything else on the menu is either free or really reasonably priced. So that, I think Five Guys is a psychological discovery, if you like. I think they've discovered a new way of pricing for a meal, which just somehow appeals to quite a lot of people quite a lot of the time. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it'll ever take over from McDonald's. I don't think it'll become, casual dining. But in kind of tourist areas or very highly densely populated areas, Five Guys is, in a sense, the opposite of McDonald's. And so that's my point. We know much less than we know. We need to test much more. We shouldn't then assume that the knowledge we have is the only knowledge we need in order to solve a problem. And we should test things that don't make sense alongside testing things we do. And I've recorded this locally. I hope if ever you need to use this to win an argument with an accountant or a procurement person that you can. But let me end with one final point. I think these entities like finance and procurement are slightly dodgy. And let me explain why I think they're dodgy. And I'd say the same of management consultants as well, to a great extent. What management consultants and finance and procurement are allowed to do in a business is take the credit for cost savings without ever being put in the frame for lost opportunities or missed opportunities. So you've created an asymmetric entity where you can claim the credit for money you've saved, but nobody ever accounts for the opportunities you miss as a consequence. And so if you give the finance department too much power, you grossly bias the activities of your business towards doing sensible things and doing less and less. And effectively, you turn your business in so that it's optimized around efficiency, not optimized around discovery. There's always a trade-off between efficiency and discovery. And if you put the decision in the hand of the finance guy, he's biased because he can claim the credit for cost savings and never have to get blamed for missed opportunities, because cost savings are immediate and quantifiable and go on the balance sheet. Missed opportunities are invisible. They never appear in print because nobody sees them. But nonetheless, if you look at the balance between, as bees have learned over 20 million years, if you look at the balance between efficiency optimizing and opportunity seeking, there's a trade-off between the two. And finance and procurement are allowed to get by pretending that there isn't. So tell them that. I've put this on record. By all means, use this film to tell them exactly that. They effectively profit from an asymmetry. Management consultants do this as well.